Good afternoon. Thanks so much for being with us. We are midway through Rising Economy Week. I'm Stacy Ross on CHEK News Spotlight. Tonight we are very pleased to be talking with a couple of working moms, three working moms. We'll be discussing this very important issue with you this afternoon. We're not talking about a recession, we're talking about a she-cession and COVID's uneven impact on the workforce. So joining me today, very excited to be talking to these two working women, two working moms. Sylvia Fuller is a professor of sociology at the University of British Columbia. And Jody Rechenmacher is the director, an engineer. She's a director in urban matters in that great company as well. Ladies, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. And we know that COVID has hit so many sectors of our society so tremendously. But there is a disproportionate number of women who have been hit hard by this pandemic and how it's played out in Canada and around the world. And there's a couple of parts of that I want to talk about. And Sylvia, I'm hoping to start with you. And that we know that 1/6 of jobs held by women disappeared in February and March as this pandemic was started. Talk to us about that and tell us a bit more about why that played out the way it did.
Well, a lot of that has to do with the fact that we still have a labor market that has a high level of gender segregation in it. So women and men aren't always working in the same kinds of work. So the sectors that were hit hard, especially in the early, lockdown periods of the pandemic, were sectors that were disproportionately employing women. So retail, hospitality, hotels, restaurants. These are all sectors where both men and women work, but women work in a larger share. So when you have a disproportionate impact on those sectors of the economy, then you're going to see women hit harder. And you also saw part-time workers hit harder. And again, women are more likely to be working part-time. So certainly the kinds of jobs that men and women tend to be employed in, and the fact that all that sort of in-person interaction was being shut down, that was one of the reasons why women were really hit hard.
Equally as concerning, I think, and you'll probably maybe even more concerning, is a recent survey that's come out now, Polaris Strategy Insights. They suggest that a third of women, more than a third, about 33% of women are now considering not returning to the workforce, even if they have the opportunity to, and that compares with about 19% for men. So Jody, you're a working mom, you have two young kids at home. What's your take on this and why you think that's happening?
Yeah, I think that even though we've seen a lot of improvements in women in the workforce, and I'm working in a professional environment, so it's even an environment where you can work from home, you have that privilege, that option. I think a lot of women continue to carry a lot of the care burden at home and care responsibilities. And so adding that on top of full-time work, I know for myself, the pandemic took a lot of the supports I had in place and a lot of the coping mechanisms that I needed to be able to continue to contribute at the level that I wanted to contribute. And so I'm currently on mat leave and going back to work in January, and I don't think I'll be able to return in a full-time capacity. And I'm seeing a lot of my colleagues in similar positions just not being able to work at 100% and shifting back to 70%, 60%, 50% to be able to still provide the care at home, especially when we're in such a precarious care position. Schools have reopened, daycares have reopened, but it's all very precarious. So having the reliability of those systems is really important.
Now, Jody, I want to talk a bit more about your situation quickly here. You are a mother of two young kids. I think you said a 10-month-old and a 3-year-old. So how is it divvied up in your household? Between your husband and yourself. Do you feel like you're doing the bulk of the work, of the caregiving, the shopping, the cleaning, and dealing with your kids?
Certainly while I'm on mat leave, and I think that's okay. I think when I was working and when I go back to work, then there will be an element of the caretaking with the kids that I guess in our household, we've just found that I'm more consistently suited for. So when he takes on, well, he takes on certainly his share, but it's focused on different kinds of household activities, things like cleaning, doing the dishes, those kinds of things. And so that's greatly appreciated, but it doesn't have the same kind of impact when we lose care systems, for example.
Now, Sylvia, before I bring you back in, I want to encourage those who are with us virtually today to weigh in, ask some questions, make some comments. No guarantee we'll get to them all, but we are always looking for your feedback and would appreciate that if you have something you'd like to contribute today. So Sylvia, talk about this, this idea. I mean, we have both men and women working from home, being at home now. I mean, is that situation playing out in households across the country where the women are taking on the bulk of this?
So that's a great question. There is some evidence that where men are working from home, that has increased their involvement in both childcare and housework. But for the majority of families, when they report on, how does it compare in the pandemic versus before the pandemic in terms of, who's doing most of all these different tasks? Most families are not reporting any shift there. So if we're moving towards greater equality, I would say we're inching towards greater equality. It hasn't really been a dramatic shift. And so we have, some Statistics Canada data from early June, for example, that I was just looking at. And, 42% of women with kids under 18 reported that it was mostly them who stayed home with the children when the care wasn't available. Only 8% of fathers reported that it was mostly them taking on this role. And it's similar for homeschooling, right? So, 47% of women and only 14% of men claiming that it was mostly them who performed this activity. Now, interestingly, men are more likely to say that it was equally shared than women are. So I think that there's definitely a difference in perception there too, where men maybe think that because they have increased their activity that it's more equal, and the women are thinking, it's still, you may have increased it, but it's still not equal. So that pattern that you're reporting in your personal life, Jody, that seems to be pretty consistent with these broader patterns. And we do have these longstanding ideals, right, or cultural norms that lead people to feel that caregiving is sort of uniquely suited to women. And often that is framed just in the way that you framed it, Jody, as, I'm suited to it. I'm good at it. I have those skills. But of course, it's important to recognize that, these skills and capacities are also developed through practice. And we have systems that encourage it to be the women who are taking the bulk, if not all, of the maternity leave and developing those skills as well. And so when we do see men take on more of that role, they also get better at it. So that's my personal advice to you in thinking about those arrangements. But certainly, in practice, this care crisis that the pandemic has created has really been disproportionately impacting mothers, and we see that in the numbers. I've been looking with my colleague Yue Chan at what's been happening to the gap in employment among mothers and fathers who were previously employed prior to the pandemic. And we're just really, saw a big gap opening up over the course of the pandemic. Now, the good news is that it did close somewhat, although not entirely for everybody, when school started to open up again in the fall, particularly for people who had sort of elementary school kids, right? It didn't close up as much for those with little kids, right? But as Jody says, there's a lot of ongoing concern, right? We're into this second wave. Schools are starting to have closures again, and suddenly your kid has, some symptoms, or they've been exposed and they can't go to school for 2 weeks, or the school itself is closed for 2 weeks. A lot of daycares, even though they've been allowed to reopen, are not actually reopening because they have limited enrollment, and fiscally they can't manage that, especially with all the extra precautions. So while things got better, we're by no means out of the woods yet, and there is definitely a risk of those gaps, I would say, opening up again as this second wave gathers steam.
Right. And Jody, you were talking earlier about systems being in place to support you as you wanted to go back to work full-time or as much as you could. Do you think that childcare, accessible childcare, is really the key to helping, prevent this disparity?
I mean, I certainly think that is a very important part of it. I think part of the complexity of our current situation is that there is no one key. So the childcare piece, there's a lot of room for improvement there. And then there's also, there are different things that different stakeholders and participants in the system can influence. So businesses can provide more flexibility. They can allow people to continue to work from home or find different working arrangements based on what work for them, and not treating everybody the same, because even two women might be in different circumstances where for one, it's very advantageous to work at home, and the other, it might be preferable to be working in an office setting or somewhere else. So So yeah, I think that care is a big piece of it, and having those solid systems, but it's not the silver bullet also.
I got a very good response here from Andre. From Jessie Ann, actually. She says, how can women without caregiving responsibilities best support their colleagues who do, factoring in remote work and other pandemic measures? So Jody, let's start with you. What's your answer to Jessie Ann?
Oh, it's a very generous question. I love it. I think I think it comes even to being authentically them. I think part of it, so this is, I think that women need to be able to lead in genuine ways that aren't just emulating what is traditionally a male leadership style. And so in a way, leading just in an authentic way that creates space for other women to request the flexibility or to bring more of their family life into work as is appropriate. Yeah, I think just also saying thank you sometimes to your colleagues, saying, are you okay? How are you doing? Wow, that must be really tough what you're taking on. I think just a little bit of acknowledgement and appreciation, whether you're a peer, whether you're in a leadership role, whether you're even observing some of these things on that's happening to a manager or somebody senior to you. I think just some of that recognition can really help.
Absolutely. Thank you very, very much for that, Jessie Ann. Really appreciate that. For you, Sylvia, a question here from Tina. What bold ideas are there for tackling the she-cession? What else can we do besides working on a childcare strategy to ensure that we don't lose this generation of educated and experienced female talent? What are some new ideas that you think might work?
That's a great question, and I think we have to look short term and longer term, right? Short term, we need to make sure that people have that our employment standards, for example, are strong enough to protect people with caregiving responsibilities from losing their jobs because of it. And most provinces have enacted temporary changes to their employment standards in recognition of the fact that folks who have caregiving responsibilities might not be able to, work in the existing way, but that they should have the right to go back to the jobs, just like they would if they were on parental leave, for example. But that isn't actually the case across the country. So Quebec, for example, you've got 10 days. 10 days while your job is protected. I mean, that's like one kid who has a school exposure, and then that's it, you're done. Your employer is free to fire you if you're not able to come back to work. So I think we certainly need to be really ensuring that we have those protections in place and that we're adequately considering how people's family status might be impacting their employment, and that they're not discriminated against or adversely impacted. And so, looking at our policy architecture around that, and also looking around enforcement and knowledge so that people know what their rights are, right? Because often people don't know what their rights are. So that's really, I would say that is something that is also important. In addition to, the childcare infrastructure, which is such a critical component, especially as we are in danger of losing what we have. We already have an inadequate infrastructure. We don't have enough access to high quality, affordable care anywhere in this country, really. And we're in danger of losing what we do have because these are often very marginal small businesses that cannot handle a sustained financial hit. And I don't think that we've invested enough in sort of supporting and maintaining that infrastructure, let alone rolling out a more sustainable system in the long run. I also think that looking ahead, this is an opportunity to think about how might we reorganize our ways of working in a way that make them better suited for really everybody. And by making them better, more flexible, more adaptable for everybody's life circumstances, recognizing that people do have lives outside of work that are important and meaningful and that contribute to the social good, whether that's through caregiving or through other activities that people do, that we need to organize our our work arrangements and our rights around that. So some countries, for example, in Europe have the rights to request, flexible, more flexible work arrangements. And the employer has to, really demonstrate why it's not possible in that case, rather than seeing that as sort of an individual favor or entitlement that people are often afraid to ask for because they fear that they'll be marginalized in the workplace and not seen as dedicated if they do. So there's shifts that we can do around there. And we've demonstrated in this pandemic that we can be much more flexible in many cases, not for all jobs, but for many jobs we can. And so I think looking into sort of how we might make that work more more possible to integrate with caregiving is ultimately going to help us all down the road. And it will not just have benefits for mothers, but it will have benefits for everybody. And so I think that that's part of the longer term vision too.
So Jody, then, as part of the corporate world, do you think it's the corporate world that needs to be held to account here? Do we need to put their feet to the fire to get them to make changes, or is it government responsibility? How do you think that we can actually make these changes come to fruition?
I think it's both. And I think, so speaking as both an employee, but also a part owner in my company, it's certainly, business needs to be held accountable. And there is even an element of leadership. So beyond kind of holding up the bottom, it's what can we do to encourage some more leadership from business? So even business speaking up to government and saying care systems are important to us. And maybe as business, we don't have all of the answers, but we're going to hold you, government, accountable. We're going to watch what you're doing. And you've made promises, especially in this recent election, at the provincial level, to improve these systems, and we're paying attention. We're invested in this. It's important to us, to all of our employees, to all of our staff. So I think that's certainly something that business could do. Just be a more active voice, because it matters to business. And then yes, employers have certainly a role, and government has a role to change the regulations, as Sylvia mentioned. So it's everybody working together. And I think there's a real need to bring everybody together in a conversation about this, because I think that everybody's been thinking about it in their silos and working on solutions in their silos. But I think this pandemic provides us a real opportunity to convene some tables, maybe on a regional basis, and identify where we can test things out. What can we pilot? What can we try out? Because we don't have much to lose. And this is a time to try new ways of doing things.
Do you think, Sylvia, that there is a broader appetite for this in the corporate world? We still know that there's a disproportionate number of men, leading corporations and at the higher end of these corporations than there are women. Do they care about that? Generally, is this something that's viable on a broader sense across the country?
I think that's a really excellent question. Folks have been making the business case for supporting women's employment, for providing work arrangements that are better integrated with people's lives, that are more flexible. The business case for that has been made for a long time now. We have a lot of evidence that not only can providing more flexibility, more humane arrangements be good for employees' well-being, but it can be good for retention, it can be good for productivity. There's all kinds of business outcomes that are also, tend to be really positively related to that. But I think what it has come up against is a sort of entrenched cultural idea of what it means to be the ideal worker, what it means to be somebody who is really an up-and-comer, who is going to be suitable for a leadership opportunity in an organization. And that has historically been a male model, right? It's been a model of someone who has somebody else to take care of all those other life responsibilities, so that you can be available anytime, anywhere, moment's notice, travel, at the drop of the hat, work late into the evenings, even if that's not actually the best way to do work and to get creative, good work done, right? There's been this sort of ratcheting up of expectations, so that face time, that kind of visible busyness and overwork has been really seen as the marker of someone who is dedicated and who's a good employee. And so, all of these sort of like business cases that have been made about, maybe changing or adapting that model have really run up against that cultural wall, because people are invested in that model. And the folks who are at the top of the organizations are the people who are able to fit that model, right? Often they're men who have wives who are, either not employed or employed in less demanding jobs that, often they've scaled back in order to enable their partners to be able to, have that really high level of work dedication. So I think it is a challenge, but I do think that the pandemic has stripped away, some of the surface excuses for not making change, and has really demonstrated that it is possible and that it can work, right? I mean, people are often also averse to change, and they're afraid of, making changes that might be, seen as going too far or potentially not working out. So I do think that there is some opportunity, but I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about it, because I think that there's also very long-standing cultural ideas that frankly suit the interests of those who have already been in positions of power, because they fit the model of their lives well.
Right. Jody, there are some that are afraid that this pandemic and its impact on women particularly will undo the gender equity work that's been done over the past 20 years. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that it's a legitimate concern. I think that if we don't all take action at all different levels, that it's something that could happen. I mean, even in my experience in our firm, as I had mentioned, so me not being able to return to work full time, a number of my female colleagues no longer being able to work full time, and reducing their hours, their presence in some of the roles that they were playing. That includes mentorship of other women coming into the workplace and building their careers. And then it becomes an issue of not being able to be what you can't see. And so I think that it's certainly a concern in places where women are outright losing their jobs. But even when they're not, even when it's a matter of, just stepping back a little bit, it's still a concern. Because I think that also provides more, in a sense, it kind of reverts back to the stereotype of the up and comer that Sylvia was talking about. And so that person can still be there and can still be present because they've got other systems in place. They don't have the caregiving responsibilities. And so it kind of, there's in a way, it could entrench that view further, that these are the people who can be here. So I think there is a real concern. Right.
Sylvia, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, I'm not panicking yet. we are seeing some improvement in the trends as the schools came back and the childcares were opening up. I don't actually think we're at risk of going back to the 1950s, for example. I don't want to overstate the risk, but I do think that it is right to be concerned and to be thinking about what's going on. And I will add to what Jody was saying, is that there's a real danger in responding to this pandemic and the very real sort of immediate care crisis of having a scenario where we have this unprecedented change, but we're still responding in the old ways. And the old ways are assuming that it's women's responsibility to be the backup plan. That is women's responsibility to step up on the care front and step back on the work front. And so long as men are not also stepping up, and men in leadership positions, and modeling that this is everybody's responsibility, you are still going to have the risk of marginalizing women. And this is, in fact, this is something that is a real dilemma that happens in organizations, where sometimes organizations with the best of intentions, right, create sort of different opportunities for more flexible kinds of working, whether that's job sharing or the opportunity to work part-time or 80% hours or something like this. But that it's done in a way where the expectation is that this is something for women and that this is what they're going to do to help women in their organization. And so when it's coded that way in a gendered way, what happens is that the women are sort of like encouraged to take advantage of this possibility, and it seems great at the far, on the surface. But in fact, then they're actually damaged by doing so, because they are seen as not as dedicated. Not there's a stigma to taking advantage of those things, and it's associated with women. So any of those initiatives around organizations making changes, trying to help women, they have to be done in a gender neutral way that encourages everybody to take advantage of it, that encourages this not to be seen as something that is like for working mothers or for women, because that's really a pathway to marginalization. So men need to step up, and organizations, when they're thinking about what they're doing, they need to be thinking about this, not just that women have caregiving responsibility, but that everybody does, so that men are also encouraged to take advantage of these opportunities, to think about them as being for them as well, so that we will be more likely to get to a situation where we're able to combine working and caring as important parts of everybody's lives.
Well, it's been such a thrill to speak with both of you today. We are nearing the end of our time, and I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to leave us with some closing comments about the idea of the she-cession and this disparity in the workplace and the uphill battle we seemingly are facing even more during this pandemic than we have in the past, if that's even possible. So let's start with you. Any closing comments on what you'd like to see, or if you're optimistic that things will change for your personal circumstance and for circumstances of other working moms who are trying to find their way through this COVID-19 thing?
Yeah, I think it's nothing groundbreaking, but I think the first step is to not pretend that we don't have a problem. I think that there are a number of interactions that I've had throughout my career where kind of seeking better has been met with the reaction of, hey, don't you know how good we have it right now? 15 years ago, we wouldn't have had this such and such an opportunity. Let's just be grateful for where we're at. And that's not helpful. We can be grateful for the progress we've made, and we can still want better, because better will be better for everyone. It's not just women. So I think that it's critical that we pay attention to the fact that there are still gender disparities, and this does make a difference in the lives of women and the careers of women and the lives of everyone, careers of everyone. So let's just be aware to start of what the issue is, how it's a problem in our organizations, for ourselves, in our families. Let's acknowledge it so that we can start working on it.
A great comment, Jody. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Sylvia, let's finish with you and give you the last word on what we've been talking about today.
I think those are just really wonderful comments from Jody. And I would say that, this idea that we should be grateful for what we have and not think about what we could still do to make it better can be a real limitation and a real barrier. When I look cross-nationally as an academic, but what other countries do, I can see there's lots of things that other places are doing that we can pick up on, that are models for us, that we can do better. And sometimes I think that we're somewhat disadvantaged in Canada by living next to the United States, which is such an outlier and having the worst possible family policies, that we feel grateful in comparison, without realizing that actually, whether that's in our, employment laws or our, broader social policies, that we actually can be doing so much better than we are. And so the last thing I would just say is change doesn't change unless we change it. It's up to us, right? All of us to work together to continue to try and address these real problems and create a better, more equitable, and more sustainable world for everyone.
All right, let's do it. Sylvia Fuller from the Department of Sociology, professor at the University of British Columbia, and Jody Rechenmacher, engineer and director for urban systems. Thank you. You're such wonderfully powerful and strong, intelligent women. So grateful to have had a chance to spend this time with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.